The velvet ring box felt heavier than it should in my palm as I stood outside the grand ballroom, rehearsing what I'd say when I presented it to Joseph during our engagement toast. 2 years together, and tonight was supposed to seal our forever. The string quartet played softly inside. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed off marble walls. Everything was perfect. I decided to take the scenic route through the garden corridor to surprise him on the terrace, where he told me he'd be getting some air before the big announcement. The fairy lights twisted through the ivy, creating a romantic pathway, and I imagined his face when he saw the vintage band I'd spent months hunting down. It belonged to my grandfather, the only family heirloom I had left, and giving it to Joseph meant giving him everything. But when I rounded the corner and the terrace came into view through the floor-to-ceiling windows, my entire world fractured. Joseph wasn't alone, and he wasn't just standing there. His hands were tangled in someone else's hair, his mouth pressed desperately against lips that weren't mine. The moonlight illuminated them both clearly, and my stomach dropped when I recognized the other person, Elliot. My cousin Elliot, who was supposed to get married tomorrow to his girlfriend of 5 years. Elliot, who'd helped me pick out this very suit I was wearing. Elliot, who'd given a speech an hour ago about the sanctity of commitment. The ring box slipped from my fingers and clattered against the stone pathway. Neither of them heard it. They were too consumed with each other. Joseph's back pressed against the balcony railing, Elliot's hands gripping his waist like he was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a drunken accident. This was something that had history, familiarity, desperation. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process what my eyes were showing me, because it contradicted everything I thought I knew. Joseph told me he loved me this morning. He'd kissed my forehead and whispered that tonight would change our lives. He was right, just not in the way either of us expected. My legs finally remembered how to function, and I turned away before they could see me. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to confront them, to demand answers, to make a scene. But the broken part, the part that felt like it was bleeding internally, just wanted to disappear. I stumbled back toward the ballroom, my vision blurring at the edges. There you are, sweetheart. We've been looking everywhere. Joseph's mother, Patricia, caught my arm with her perfectly manicured hand, her smile bright and oblivious. The toast is about to start. Where's that handsome son of mine? My mouth opened, but no sound came out. What could I possibly say? Your son is currently destroying my life on the terrace with my cousin. The words felt too big, too real, too devastating to speak aloud. He'll be here, I managed, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. Patricia squeezed my arm affectionately and glided away toward the champagne fountain. Around me, guests mingled in their expensive suits and designer dresses, completely unaware that the engagement they came to celebrate was already over. I felt like a ghost, moving through a party thrown for a dead man. Then I saw them enter. Joseph walked in first, his collar slightly askew, his lips redder than they'd been an hour ago. He was adjusting his cuff links with hands that should have been steadier. Elliot followed seconds later, from a different entrance, his expression carefully neutral, but I caught the way his eyes searched the room and landed on Joseph with unmistakable longing. How long? How long had this been happening? Were there others before Elliot? Every late-night work meeting, every business trip, every time he'd been too tired for intimacy suddenly took on a sinister new context. I felt sick. Liam. Joseph spotted me, and his face lit up with a smile that now seemed like a weapon. He crossed the room in quick strides and reached for my hand. There you are, ready for the... I yanked my hand away before his fingers could make contact. Several nearby guests noticed, their conversations faltering. I need to talk to you. Now. Privately. My voice came out harder than I intended, but I was past caring about appearances. Can it wait? Everyone's watching, and Dad's about to give the welcome speech. I saw you, Joseph. The words dropped between us like stones into still water. His smile didn't just fade, it shattered. Color drained from his face, and his eyes widened with an emotion I recognized immediately because I'd seen it countless times in my work as a counselor. Pure, undiluted guilt. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Before he could formulate whatever excuse or denial or plea he was constructing, the sharp ping of metal against crystal silenced the room. Everyone turned toward the small stage where the microphone stood, but it wasn't Joseph's mother standing there as planned. It was his father. Mr. Charles Reed commanded attention without trying. At 52, he had the kind of presence that made boardrooms go quiet and competitors nervous. His salt and pepper hair was immaculately styled, his charcoal suit fit like it was painted on, and his steel gray eyes missed absolutely nothing. Those eyes were currently fixed on his son with an intensity that made even me uncomfortable, and I wasn't the target. "Thank you all for joining us this evening," Charles began, his voice smooth and controlled, but I caught the edge underneath. "I know you're here to celebrate my son Joseph's engagement to Liam." Applause started, but Charles raised his hand, and it died immediately. "However, I have an announcement that will surprise everyone, including the couple in question." His gaze shifted to me, and something in those gray depths made my pulse spike. "After careful consideration and recent developments that have come to my attention, Joseph and Liam's engagement is canceled. Effective immediately." The collective gasp that swept through the room sounded like a wave crashing. I felt it rather than heard it, the shock rippling outward from Charles's words. Beside me, Joseph made a strangled sound. "Dad, what are you?" Charles continued as if his son hadn't spoken. "But there will be a wedding in this house 1 week from today." My heart stopped. Actually stopped beating for what felt like an eternity. I will be marrying Liam myself. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. Even the servers frozen with trays halfway to tables. I couldn't feel my legs, couldn't feel my hands, couldn't feel anything except the weight of hundreds of eyes on me and the impossible reality of what had just been said. Charles's gaze held mine across the room, and in that moment, I saw something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't cruelty. It was something far more complex, layered with meaning I didn't have the capacity to decode while my world was imploding. Joseph grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "He's lost his mind." "Dad, you can't." "Can't I?" Charles descended from the stage with measured steps, pulling his phone from his inner pocket. He tapped the screen twice and held it up. "Security footage from the terrace, timestamped 20 minutes ago. Would you like me to play it for our guests, or would you prefer to exit quietly?" I watched the blood drain from Joseph's face as understanding crashed over him like a tidal wave. His hand fell away from my arm, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely terrified. Not embarrassed, not caught, terrified. "You wouldn't," Joseph whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Test me." Charles's tone could have frozen hell itself. I've built my reputation on following through with exactly what I say. The tension stretched so tight I thought it might snap and take all of us with it. Then Elliot, who'd been trying to blend into the wallpaper near the bar, made the catastrophic decision to move toward the exit. "Stay exactly where you are, Elliot." Charles didn't even look at him, but my cousin froze mid-step like he'd hit an invisible wall. "You're not dismissed." Patricia rushed forward, her earlier joy replaced with barely concealed panic. "Charles, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Our guests came to witness a commitment." "They're witnessing one," Charles said, his expression not softening even for his ex-wife. "Just not the one they expected." His gaze found mine again. "Liam, please come with me." It wasn't really a request, despite the word please. It was a command wrapped in politeness, and my body responded before my brain could engage. I walked toward him on autopilot, aware of every whisper that erupted in my wake. every phone being raised to capture this disaster, every shocked face turning to follow my movements. Charles placed a hand on my lower back, professional but unmistakably possessive, and guided me through a side door into a hallway that muffled the chaos behind us. We walked in silence past family portraits and expensive art until he opened a heavy oak door and ushered me into what appeared to be a private study. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls. A massive desk dominated one corner, its surface organized with military precision. The 4th wall was entirely glass, overlooking the garden where fairy lights still twinkled like nothing had changed, like my entire existence hadn't just been rewritten without my permission. Charles closed the door and leaned against it, and for the first time since his announcement, he looked human, tired. The mask of control slipped just enough for me to see the man underneath the armor. "Before you say anything," he started, his voice losing some of its earlier steel, "I know what I just did was insane. Insane doesn't begin to cover it." I found my voice finally, and it came out sharper than I intended. "You just told a room full of people that you're marrying your son's ex-fiancé. Do you understand how that sounds?" "I understand exactly how it sounds." He moved to a cabinet and poured 2 glasses of something amber. He held one out to me, and I took it because my hands needed something to do besides shake. "I also understand that my son just humiliated you in front of everyone who matters in this city. So your solution is to humiliate him back, using me as your weapon?" The whiskey burned going down, but it helped clear the fog in my head. "No." Charles set his glass down and faced me fully. "My solution is to offer you an alternative to becoming the person everyone pities. The jilted lover who wasn't enough. The one who got cheated on at his own engagement party." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You think those people out there will ever let you forget this? You think you'll be able to walk into any room in this social circle without being defined by what Joseph did?" His words hit harder than I wanted to admit, because he was right. I'd seen it happen to others, watched reputations crumble and identities dissolve into cautionary tales. The thought of becoming that person made my skin crawl. "And marrying you changes that how? Because you become the person who upgraded." Charles pulled an envelope from his desk drawer and handed it to me. "This is a contract. I'm not asking you to fall in love with me or play house. I'm offering you a business arrangement that benefits us both." My fingers trembled as I pulled out the papers. Legal jargon filled the pages, but certain phrases jumped out. Financial security, separate residences within shared property, public appearances as needed, termination clause after 1 year with full settlement. "You planned this." I looked up at him, trying to read his expression. "You had this contract ready." "I've been watching my son self-destruct for months." Charles's jaw tightened. "I knew something like this would happen eventually. I didn't know when or how, but I knew Joseph wasn't capable of the commitment he promised you. So yes, I prepared for contingencies." "Why me? Why not just let your son face the consequences alone?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through every defense I'd ever built. "Because you quit your job for him. You moved from Seattle to be with him here. You cut ties with friends who warned you he wasn't ready for this level of commitment. You invested everything into a future with someone who didn't deserve that investment." He stepped closer, and I could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated. "Because I've watched you at family dinners, being kind to staff, asking genuine questions about people's lives, making my pretentious relatives actually laugh. Because when my mother was sick last year, you were the only one who visited her in the hospital besides me." I'd forgotten about that. Mrs. Reed Sr. had been this formidable woman who'd scared everyone except me. We bonded over crossword puzzles and terrible hospital coffee. "She talked about you constantly after that," Charles continued, and something in his voice cracked. "Said you reminded her of my father. Kind without weakness, strong without cruelty. She died thinking you'd be her grandson-in-law, and I had to lie to her because I knew what Joseph was doing. You knew about him and Elliot? I suspected. I hired an investigator 3 months ago. The report confirmed it last week. He picked up his whiskey and drained it. I was planning to confront them after tonight. But then I saw them on the security feed, and I realized this was my chance to do something right. To protect someone who actually deserved protection. The contract suddenly felt heavier in my hands. This wasn't just about revenge or appearances. This was about a father trying to salvage something good from his son's wreckage. What do you get out of this? I asked really. Beyond punishing Joseph? Charles met my eyes, and what I saw there made my breath catch. Loneliness. Bone-deep, soul-crushing loneliness. Honestly, company. Someone at the dinner table who doesn't want something from me. Someone who might actually care if I came home at the end of the day. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. Pathetic, isn't it? One of the wealthiest men in the state, and I'm lonely enough to bribe someone into keeping me company. It's not pathetic, I heard myself say. It's human. We stood there in silence, the weight of the decision hanging between us like fog. Outside, the party had dissolved into chaos. I could hear raised voices, slamming doors, the rev of engines as guests fled the scandal. My phone was buzzing nonstop in my pocket, probably everyone I'd ever known demanding explanations I didn't have. I looked at the contract again. 1 year. Financial security. A chance to rebuild my life on my own terms instead of as Joseph's victim. And maybe, possibly, the opportunity to help someone else who was just as broken as I felt. Where do I sign? The courthouse ceremony took 17 minutes. I know because I counted every second, watching the clock on the wall behind the judge's head as she droned through standard vows that felt anything but standard. Charles's voice remained steady throughout, his hand warm and solid when he slipped the platinum band onto my finger. My own hand shook so badly he had to steady it with his other palm. You may kiss to seal the union. Charles leaned in, and I caught the briefest hesitation in his eyes, a silent question. I gave the smallest nod, and his lips brushed mine for exactly 2 seconds. Professional. Respectful. Nothing like the passionate kisses I'd imagined for my wedding day. But then again, nothing about this resembled any fantasy I'd ever had. Congratulations, the judge said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd probably seen enough unusual marriages in this courthouse to recognize ours for what it was. The witnesses were Charles's lawyer and his assistant, both of whom maintained perfectly neutral expressions throughout. No family, no friends, no one who would ask questions we didn't want to answer. The press release would go out tomorrow, carefully worded by Charles's PR team to make this seem like a natural progression rather than the spectacular implosion it actually was. Ready? Charles asked as we walked toward his car, and I wasn't sure if he meant for the drive home or for the entire next year of our lives. The house looked different arriving as a spouse rather than a guest. I'd been here dozens of times for family dinners and holiday parties, always as Joseph's plus one. Always temporary. Now the security guard waved us through with a respectful nod, and the gates closed behind us with a finality that made my chest tight. Your belongings were moved to the east wing, Charles said as we entered the foyer. The chandelier overhead cast prismatic patterns across marble floors that probably cost more than my childhood home. I had the interior designer come in yesterday to update the room based on the preferences you mentioned once at dinner. I hope she got it right. I stared at him. You remember a conversation about interior design from months ago? I remember everything you've said. He set his keys in a crystal dish by the door. You prefer warm colors over cool ones. Natural light over artificial. You hate minimalism because you think it feels sterile. You collect vinyl records, even though streaming is easier. You take your coffee black in the morning, but with cream in the afternoon. He paused. Should I continue? It was simultaneously flattering and unsettling to be so thoroughly observed. You're telling me you've been paying attention this whole time? Someone had to. The bitterness in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. My son certainly wasn't. He led me upstairs, down a hallway I'd never explored before. The east wing was quieter than the main house, more private. He opened double doors to reveal a space that stole my breath. The walls were painted a deep sage green, and wide windows overlooked the garden. A king-sized bed with a wrought iron headboard dominated one wall, covered in layers of cream and rust-colored bedding that looked incredibly soft. Bookshelves lined another wall, already filled with volumes that made my heart skip. First editions of my favorite authors, the complete works of poets I'd mentioned loving. A vintage record player sat in the corner with a collection of jazz and blues albums. "The West Wing is mine," Charles said from the doorway. "There's a bathroom through that door, fully stocked with everything you should need. If anything's missing, just let Marcus know. He's the house manager." This is too much. I turned to face him, overwhelmed by the care evident in every detail. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yes, I did." His expression was unreadable. "This may be a contract marriage, but you're still my spouse, and you'll be treated as such. That means respect, consideration, and ensuring your comfort. I won't have you feeling like a prisoner in your own home." Our home. The words felt foreign but not entirely unwelcome. "I should let you settle in," he continued, already turning away. "Dinner is at 7 if you're hungry. No pressure to join if you prefer space tonight." "Charles." He paused at the threshold. "Thank you. For the room. For everything." He nodded once and disappeared down the hall, his footsteps fading until I was alone with my thoughts and 1,000 questions I didn't know how to answer. The first week passed in a strange blur of adjustments. Charles left for his office downtown at 6 every morning and returned around 8 each evening. We'd have dinner together in the formal dining room, making careful small talk about safe topics, the weather, current events, the quality of the chef's cooking. Never anything personal. Never anything that might crack the professional veneer we'd established. But I noticed things. The way he always asked if I needed anything before leaving. How he'd set aside the art section of the newspaper because he'd somehow learned I liked reading reviews. The fresh flowers that appeared in my room every 3 days, always in shades I loved. On the 8th night, I found him in the library at midnight. I'd gone down for water and seen the light under the door. He sat in a leather armchair, reading glasses perched on his nose, completely absorbed in whatever document demanded his attention. "Can't sleep?" I asked from the doorway. He looked up, startled. It was the first time I'd seen him anything less than completely composed. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his hair had that disheveled quality that came from running fingers through it too many times. "Merger negotiations." He gestured to the papers scattered around him. "The other company's lawyers are being difficult about Clause 17. I had no idea what Clause 17 was, but something made me walk into the room and settle into the chair across from him. "Want to talk about it?" Sometimes explaining helps. He blinked, clearly not expecting the offer. "You don't have to." "I know." I settled deeper into the chair. "But we're stuck with each other for the next year. Might as well try being friends." "Friends." The word hung between us, and I saw something shift in his expression, like he'd been braced for hostility or cold tolerance, and relief caught him off guard. "Okay," he said slowly, "but only if you let me make tea. The good kind I keep hidden from everyone else." We stayed up until 3 in the morning. He explained the merger in terms I could actually understand, and I found myself genuinely interested in the strategy behind corporate negotiations. In return, I told him about the art therapy program I'd been researching, something I wanted to start once I figured out my next career move. "You should do it," he said with conviction. "You have the background in counseling, the passion for helping people, and the creative instinct. Why hesitate? Money, resources, not knowing where to start." I curled deeper into the chair, the tea warming my hands. "It feels like a pipe dream. Dreams stop being dreams when you have the means to make them real. He pulled out his phone and typed, "My assistant will call you tomorrow. I know several people who fund therapeutic arts programs. Let me make some introductions." "You don't have to do that." "I want to." He met my eyes over his reading glasses. "You gave up a lot when you moved here for Joseph. Let me help you build something that's entirely yours." The sincerity in his voice made my throat tight. This wasn't obligation or contractual duty. This was genuine support from someone who barely knew me, but was choosing to see my potential anyway. "Can I ask you something personal?" The words came out before I could stop them. "You can ask." I reserve the right not to answer. "Why are you really doing this? Not just the marriage, but all of it. The room, the books, helping with my career. What are you getting out of this besides punishing your son?" Charles was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking every one of his 52 years. "When my father died, he left me everything. The company, the houses, the investments. But his last words to me were about regret. He said he'd spent his whole life building an empire, but forgot to build relationships that mattered. He died surrounded by aides and business partners, but no one who actually loved him." His voice dropped. I looked around that hospital room and realized I was exactly the same. Successful beyond measure and completely alone. Then I watched my son make the same mistakes, and I thought maybe I could break the cycle. Maybe I could show someone genuine care before I ended up just like my father. The vulnerability in his admission cracked something open in my chest. Here was this powerful man admitting to the loneliness I'd sensed but couldn't name. "You're not your father," I said quietly. "And you're not alone anymore." His eyes found mine, and in that moment, the distance between us felt less like a canyon and more like something we could bridge if we both just reached far enough. 2 months had transformed everything about my existence. The mornings now began with Charles's hand brushing against mine as we passed each other coffee mugs in the kitchen. The afternoons I spent designing curriculum for the art therapy center that was slowly becoming reality. The evenings belonged to us both, sharing meals where conversation flowed easier than wine, discussing everything from his latest acquisition deal to my theories about color psychology and healing trauma. I was sketching floor plans for the therapy center in the sunroom when Marcus appeared in the doorway, his usual composed expression slightly strained. "Mr. Liam, there's someone at the gate requesting entry. Mr. Joseph, he insists it's urgent that he speak with you." The pencil stilled in my hand. 2 months of carefully constructed peace, of learning how to breathe without the weight of betrayal crushing my lungs, and now this. Joseph. The name alone carried ghosts I'd worked hard to bury. "Does Charles know?" I asked, buying myself seconds to decide. "Mr. Reed is in a video conference with Tokyo. I thought it best to consult you first, given the circumstances." Part of me wanted to refuse, to send Joseph away and preserve the fragile happiness I'd built. But another part, the part that still had unanswered questions festering like wounds that never quite healed, needed closure. "Let him in. I'll meet him in the front garden, not inside the house." Marcus nodded with understanding. Some battles needed neutral ground. Joseph looked thinner when he emerged from his car. Dark circles shadowed eyes that once sparkled with easy charm. His hair needed cutting, his usually pristine appearance slightly disheveled. He was wearing the blue sweater I'd given him last Christmas, and that detail felt like a calculated move. "You came," he said, stopping several feet away as if afraid I might bolt. "You have 10 minutes. Start talking." He flinched at my tone. "Good. He should feel uncomfortable. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. You blocked my number, changed your email. You're surprised? After what you did, you expected me to keep communication lines open." "No. He ran fingers through his hair, a nervous habit I recognized too well. "I wanted to apologize properly. What happened at the engagement, with Elliot, it was unforgivable." "Then why are you here asking for forgiveness?" I crossed my arms, maintaining distance. You made your choice that night. You picked your moment of passion over 2 years of building something together. It wasn't just passion. His voice cracked. Elliot and I have history, from college, before I met you. It never fully ended, and that's on me. For not being honest. With him, with you, with myself. The admission should have hurt more than it did. Instead, I felt oddly detached, like he was confessing sins committed by a stranger against someone I used to be. So you were cheating the entire time? Not physically, but emotionally. Yes. I kept going back to him in my head, comparing everything, wondering what if. You deserved so much better than half my heart. I deserved honesty. The words came out steady, surprising me. If you were confused about your feelings, you should have told me. Instead, you let me plan a future while you sabotaged it from the inside. Joseph stepped closer, desperation creeping into his expression. When I heard you married my father, I thought I'd lost my mind. Liam, he's using you. This is about punishing me, controlling me like he always has. You're caught in a game between us. Your father has shown me more genuine care in 2 months than you managed in 2 years. The truth of it rang clear as I spoke. He listens when I talk, remembers details about things I care about, supports my dreams instead of making me feel small for having them. Because he wants something from you. Joseph's voice rose. He's a businessman. Everything is a transaction. Whatever he's offering, it comes with strings attached. Maybe. I met his eyes directly, but at least he's honest about his intentions. He offered me a contract with clear terms. You offered me forever while already planning the betrayal. That's not fair. Nothing about this is fair, Joseph. Fair would have been you being brave enough to end things before destroying me publicly. Fair would have been choosing to work on yourself before dragging someone else into your mess. He reached for my arm, but I stepped back. The rejection registered on his face like a physical blow. Please, just consider that my father might not have your best interests at heart. Whatever he's told you, whatever he's promised, that's enough. Charles's voice cut through the garden like a blade through silk. He stood on the terrace, still in his dress shirt and slacks from the business call, but his presence commanded immediate attention. Joseph, you've said your piece. Time to leave. Of course you show up to play the hero. Joseph's tone turned bitter. This is what you wanted, isn't it? To take everything that was mine and prove you're superior. Charles descended the steps with measured grace, each movement deliberate. You lost Liam the moment you chose dishonesty over respect. I didn't take anything. You threw it away. He's my age. Joseph gestured wildly between us. This whole situation is twisted, and you know it. You're my father. There are boundaries, lines you don't cross, and you've obliterated all of them. Boundaries? Charles's laugh held no humor. You want to lecture me about boundaries after what you did? After I watched you receive endless chances you squandered? After I had to console your mother through tears because her son broke another good person's heart? Mom knows. Everyone knows. The footage made quite the rounds on social media before my team contained it. Your betrayal went viral, and Liam bore the brunt of that humiliation. So forgive me if I don't feel guilty about offering him shelter from the storm you created. I watched this exchange, feeling strangely removed from it, as if observing a play rather than living through it. 2 men arguing about me like I was territory to be won rather than a person capable of making my own choices. Joseph, what happened between us is over. Both of them turned to look at me. Not because your father forced it. Not because I'm trying to hurt you back. But because I've realized something these past 2 months. I've learned what it feels like to be chosen consistently. To wake up knowing someone values my presence instead of tolerating it. This marriage might have started as a contract, but it's become something real, at least for me. The confession hung in the air, more for Charles than Joseph, and I watched understanding dawn in those gray eyes. You're making a mistake, Joseph said quietly, but defeat colored his tone. Maybe, but it's mine to make. I turned away, walking toward Charles. Please leave, Joseph. There's nothing left here for you. I heard his car start, eventually, gravel crunching under tires as he drove away. Charles's hand found mine, warm and grounding, and we stood together, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of ending and beginning. Silence after Joseph's departure felt thick enough to drown in. Charles and I stood in the garden as twilight deepened around us, neither speaking, both processing what had just transpired. His hand still held mine, and I focused on that connection, that physical reminder that I wasn't alone in this strange situation we'd created. Are you all right? His voice broke the quiet, gentle in a way that made my chest ache. I think so. I turned to face him fully. I kept expecting to feel something when I saw him. Anger, hurt, maybe even residual affection. But there was just nothing, like looking at a man I used to know in another lifetime. Charles's thumb traced circles on the back of my hand, an absent gesture that somehow felt intimate. Absence of feeling can be more unsettling than pain. At least pain confirms we cared. Did you hear what I told him? About this becoming real? The question emerged smaller than I intended. His expression shifted, vulnerability flickering across features usually so controlled. I heard. Was that just for his benefit, or did you mean it? I wouldn't have said it if I didn't mean it. My heart hammered against my ribs. These past 2 months, Charles, they've changed things for me. Changed how I see you. I know we set boundaries, established this as temporary and transactional, but I've been terrible at maintaining that distance. Liam, let me finish before I lose courage. I squeezed his hand. Every morning, when you leave that newspaper section for me, every time you ask about my day and actually listen to the answer, the way you've connected me with people who can help build the therapy center, how you never push, but you're always there when I need someone. It's made me feel valued in ways I didn't even know I was starving for. Charles pulled me closer, his free hand coming up to cup my face with heartbreaking tenderness. You think I haven't been breaking my own rules? I told myself this was about protecting you, giving you resources to rebuild. But somewhere between those late-night conversations and watching you transform the East Wing into something that feels like home, I crossed lines I swore I wouldn't. What lines? My voice barely qualified as a whisper. The ones that keep me from wanting things I have no right to want. His thumb brushed my cheekbone. The ones that say I shouldn't think about you constantly during meetings. Shouldn't feel this overwhelming need to make sure you're happy, safe, challenged in good ways. Shouldn't fall asleep replaying conversations and wake up hoping you're still here. My breath caught. That sounds like, I'm falling for you, Liam. He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. Maybe I have been since the engagement party, when I saw you standing there, broken and still somehow dignified. Or maybe it's been longer, watching you at family dinners, being genuine when everyone else wore masks. I don't know when it started. I just know I can't pretend anymore. The world narrowed to the space between us, to his words hanging in the air like an offering. Every rational thought screamed about complications and power dynamics and contracts. But louder than logic was the truth beating in my chest, demanding to be spoken. I think I'm falling for you too. The admission felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating. Which seems impossible given how this started, given the circumstances. But somewhere between the contract and now, you've become the person I look for when something good happens. The one I want to tell about small victories and stupid observations. You make me feel seen in ways I didn't realize I'd been invisible. Charles's eyes searched mine, looking for doubt or hesitation. Whatever he found must have satisfied him, because he leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. Our lips met with tenderness that contradicted the intensity building between us. This wasn't the brief courthouse kiss or polite affection for appearances. This was real, deliberate, full of promise and possibility. When we finally separated, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. I have no idea how to do this, how to transition from contractual arrangement to whatever this is becoming. Neither do I. I smiled against his lips. But maybe we figure it out together. Together. He repeated the word like a vow. I liked the sound of that. We moved inside as night fully claimed the sky. But instead of retreating to separate wings as had been our pattern, Charles led me to his study. He poured 2 glasses of wine, and we settled on the leather couch that had witnessed many of our late-night conversations. "Tell me something true," he said, shifting to face me. "Something you've been holding back." I considered what truth to offer, which piece of myself to expose. Sometimes I'm terrified this is all temporary, that I'll wake up and realize I've invented feelings to cope with the situation, that you'll decide I'm not worth the complication I bring into your organized life. "You want a truth back?" At my nod, he continued. "I'm terrified you'll realize you deserve better than a man who used his power and resources to maneuver you into this arrangement. That you'll see me as manipulative, like Joseph claimed, and everything we're building will crumble." We're both scared. I set my wine aside and took his hands. Maybe that's okay. Maybe fear means we understand the stakes. "What do you want, Liam? If you could design this however you wanted, what would it look like?" The question hung between us, weighted with possibility. I thought about the contract collecting dust in a drawer somewhere, about the 1-year timeline we'd established, about all the careful parameters we'd set to keep this manageable. I want to stop counting down to an ending. The words felt risky, but necessary. I want to explore where this goes without predetermined limits. I want to move into your wing, share space and mornings, and everything in between. I want messy and complicated and real instead of safe and contractual. Charles's grip tightened on my hands. That's what I want too. Have wanted for weeks, but didn't think I had the right to ask. "So we're doing this? Choosing each other consciously instead of through circumstance?" "Yes." He pulled me into his arms, and I settled against his chest, hearing his heartbeat steady beneath my ear. "We're doing this." We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the enormity of what we'd decided. Outside, the world continued spinning, with all its complications and judgments. Inside, we created something fragile and precious that belonged only to us. 5 months into our marriage, the Art Therapy Center finally opened its doors. The converted warehouse space gleamed with fresh paint and purpose, each room designed to facilitate healing through creative expression. Charles stood beside me at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, his hand resting on my lower back in that possessive yet protective way I'd grown to cherish. "You built something extraordinary," he murmured as community members and potential clients toured the facilities. "I'm incredibly proud of you." The words settled warm in my chest. The center represented more than professional achievement. It symbolized reclaiming agency over my life, transforming pain into purpose, choosing to create rather than crumble. But the universe apparently had other plans for maintaining my newfound peace. I was locking up the center 3 days after opening when a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. Joseph emerged, looking better than he had during his last ambush, but there was still something haunted in his expression that made me wary. "Before you run," he said, hands raised in surrender, "I'm not here to cause problems. I just need 5 minutes. Please." Against my better judgment, I nodded. We stood in the parking lot under fluorescent lights that buzzed with electric persistence. "I've been in therapy," he spoke quickly, as if afraid I'd cut him off, "dealing with commitment issues and confronting why I sabotage good things. My therapist thinks I have avoidant attachment stemming from childhood trauma I never processed. Not an excuse, just context. I'm glad you're getting help." I meant it, though I kept my distance. "But if you're here hoping that changes anything between us." "I'm not." He cut me off, surprising me. "I'm here to apologize properly, without agenda. What I did was cruel and cowardly. You deserve transparency about my confusion with Elliot. You deserved someone capable of meeting you where you were instead of constantly running. I destroyed something good because I was too broken to recognize its value. The apology felt genuine, lacking the manipulation that had colored our last encounter. Maybe therapy was actually working. Thank you for saying that. It helps, hearing you take responsibility. There's something else. Joseph shifted his weight. I've been talking with Dad. Really talking, for the first time in years. I explained why he intervened the way he did. I was angry initially. Felt like he'd stolen something. But he pointed out that I'd already thrown you away. He just refused to let you drown in the aftermath. Your father saved me in ways I'm still discovering. The truth of it resonated in my bones. Not just financially or socially. He saw me when I felt invisible. He loves you. Joseph's words lacked jealousy, just stated. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Like you're the answer to questions he didn't know how to ask. Something about receiving this observation from Joseph felt like closure clicking into place. The man who'd broken me was acknowledging the man who'd helped me rebuild. I love him too. Saying it aloud to Joseph felt significant, like officially releasing the past. It started as gratitude and proximity, but it became something real. Something I want to protect and nurture. Then I'm happy for you both. Joseph smiled, and it almost reached his eyes. Elliot and I are trying to work things out properly this time. No secrets, no sneaking around. Actually dealing with our issues before attempting a relationship. Good luck with that. Seriously, we parted without animosity, and I drove home feeling lighter. The conversation had provided something I hadn't realized I needed. Joseph's blessing to move forward without guilt. Charles was waiting when I arrived, anxiety evident in the way he paced the foyer. Marcus said Joseph was at the center. Are you okay? Did he upset you? Come here. I pulled him into an embrace, feeling his tension gradually ease. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. He apologized. We had closure. It's really over now. Just like that. Just like that. I pulled back to meet his eyes. Because there's nothing left to resolve. My future isn't about him anymore. Charles studied my face, searching for cracks in my composure. What is your future about? The question felt weighted with more than casual curiosity. I'd been thinking about this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Apparently, the universe was providing it. I want to talk about the contract. His expression immediately shuddered, bracing for rejection. Wait, let me explain. I want to nullify it completely. You want a divorce? The words emerged flat, emotionless, but I saw the hurt flash across his features before he could mask it. No. God, no. I grabbed his hands, needing the connection. I want the opposite. I want to destroy that contract and build something without expiration dates or termination clauses. I want to marry you again, properly this time. Not because of circumstance or protection, but because I choose you. Because you've chosen me. Because what we have deserves a foundation built on love instead of legal obligations. The transformation in his expression was breathtaking. Walls crumbled, revealing raw emotion he usually kept carefully contained. You're certain? Because once we cross this line, there's no pretending it's temporary. No safety net of predetermined endings. I've never been more certain of anything. I brought his hands to my lips, kissing his knuckles. You've become my home, Charles. Not this house, or the security you provide you. The person who knows how I take my coffee at different times of day. Who leaves thoughtful notes when you travel. Who believes in my dreams even when I doubt them. Who makes me want to be brave enough for real vulnerability. Tears gathered in his eyes, and I watched him struggle with emotions he'd probably spent decades learning to suppress. I never imagined feeling this way again. Thought I'd missed my chance at genuine connection. Then you walked into my life through the worst circumstances and somehow became the best thing that's ever happened to me. So is that a yes? Will you marry me again, for real this time? He laughed through tears, pulling me close enough that I could feel his heartbeat matching mine. Yes, absolutely yes. We'll tear up that contract and write new vows, based on choice rather than circumstance, based on knowing exactly who we are together and wanting more of it. We stood in the foyer, holding each other as evening light faded through windows, making promises that had nothing to do with lawyers or arrangements. This was about two people who'd found each other in wreckage and decided to build something beautiful from the debris. I love you. He whispered it against my hair like a secret, like something precious he'd been hoarding. Not despite how this started, but because of who you've been throughout. Patient with my walls. Genuine when others perform. Brave enough to trust again after being shattered. I love you too. The words felt simultaneously enormous and simple. My past with Joseph brought me here, but you're my present and future. You're what I choose when all the noise falls away. We renewed our vows 1 month later in the garden where we'd first confronted Joseph together. Small ceremony. Only people who genuinely mattered. No contracts, no contingencies. Just promises made freely between two people who'd learned that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most extraordinary endings. Joseph attended, surprisingly, with Elliot beside him. They sat in the back row, respectful and quiet, and when our eyes met during the ceremony, Joseph nodded once. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or peace. Charles's mother, Patricia, wept openly but smiled at me with genuine warmth. Marcus stood beside us as witness, his stoic expression finally cracking into something resembling joy. I love you, Charles said, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. I will continue to choose you, not because of a contract, not because of obligation, but because every day with you reminds me what I was missing. You make me want to be the man you deserve. I love you too. My own voice threatened to break. You made me believe in second chances. You showed me that being seen is more important than being perfect. You are my home, and I will choose you every day for the rest of my life. We kissed, sealing promises that had nothing to do with lawyers and everything to do with hearts. The garden erupted in applause, and I finally understood what it felt like to be exactly where you belonged. 1 year later, the Art Therapy Center had expanded to 3 locations, and Charles had officially retired from day-to-day operations of his company, leaving more time for lazy mornings, garden walks, and spontaneous trips to places I'd always wanted to visit. We'd become that couple, the one we used to roll our eyes at, the ones who finished each other's sentences and couldn't keep their hands to themselves. Joseph and Elliot had married, too, quietly, in a small ceremony on the coast. They'd worked through their issues and seemed genuinely happy. Charles and I attended, not as awkward exes, but as family. Because in the end, that's what we'd become, not a replacement family, but an expanded one. Charles and I sat on the terrace, the same terrace where everything had shattered and then been rebuilt, watching sunset paint the sky. His arm wrapped around my shoulders, and I leaned into him, content in a way I'd never imagined possible. Thank you, I said, the word insufficient but true. For what? For seeing me when I was invisible. For waiting. For never treating me like a consolation prize. He pressed a kiss to my temple. You were never invisible to me. You were the only person in any room worth watching. And now I get to watch you every day. He smiled, that rare genuine smile that still made my heart skip. And I intend to spend the rest of my life doing exactly that. We sat there as darkness fell, wrapped in each other, and the knowledge that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best ones. That being chosen freely is more powerful than any contract. That love, real love, doesn't follow a script, it writes its own. The first anniversary of the Art Therapy Center's opening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Chicago feel almost gentle. Leaves painted the streets in shades of gold and crimson, and the converted warehouse space had been transformed for the evening into something unrecognizable. Soft lighting, elegant floral arrangements, and the quiet hum of donors and supporters who had come to celebrate the center's success. Charles stood beside me at the entrance, his hand a steady presence on my lower back as we greeted guests. He'd insisted on funding the entire gala himself, claiming it was the least he could do for the woman. The man, he corrected himself, who had given him a reason to look forward to mornings again. "You're staring," I murmured, catching his gaze in the reflection of a nearby window. "I'm admiring," he corrected, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "There's a difference. You're supposed to be networking. I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing." His fingers traced a light pattern against my suit jacket. "I'm watching the most remarkable person I know being celebrated for building something extraordinary." The warmth in his voice made my cheeks flush. Even after all these months, the sincerity in his words still caught me off guard. The evening proceeded smoothly. Speeches, auction items, a brief tour of the facilities for new donors. I spoke about the center's mission, the lives it had touched, and the vision for expansion. When I mentioned Charles's unwavering support, I felt his gaze on me, steady and warm. Later, after the last guests had departed and the staff had begun cleaning up, we stood alone in the main studio. The moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting silver patterns across the easels and work tables. "You were incredible tonight," Charles said, pulling me into his arms. "Every time you speak about your work, I fall in love with you all over again." I laughed softly. "Is that a scientific observation?" "It's an emotional one." He pressed his forehead to mine. "And I'm entitled to a few of those, considering I spent decades being purely logical. How's that working out for you?" "Terribly." He smiled. "I've become completely irrational about you. I think about you during board meetings. I write your name in the margins of documents. I bought a second house because you mentioned once that you liked the architecture in that neighborhood. You bought a house because I made a passing comment. I bought a house because I want to give you everything you've ever wanted, even the things you didn't know you wanted." He kissed me, slow and deep. "So yes, I'm completely irrational, and I've never been happier." Of course, life had other plans for our carefully constructed happiness. It started with a letter, official-looking, bearing the seal of the state legal department. Charles's lawyer, Marcus, delivered it personally, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. "Mr. Reed," Marcus said, setting the envelope on the desk with the careful deliberation of someone handling a live explosive, "this came through my office this morning. I thought you should see it before it becomes public." Charles opened it, his expression shifting from curiosity to cold fury in the span of a few seconds. He read it twice, then handed it to me without comment. It was a petition filed by Patricia, Joseph's mother, Charles's ex-wife, challenging the validity of our marriage. The document alleged coercion, manipulation, and undue influence on Charles's part, claiming that I had been pressured into the arrangement and that the marriage should be annulled on the grounds of fraud. "I can't believe she would do this," Charles said, his voice dangerously quiet. "After everything, after the divorce was settled, after she gave us her blessing at the renewal ceremony. She's doing it for Joseph," I said, understanding dawning. "Or rather, she's doing it because she thinks Joseph deserves what I have. She sees me as competition, not as someone who was hurt by him. Her son made his choices." Charles's jaw tightened. "And I made mine. This marriage is real, more real than anything I've ever had. I'm not going to let her destroy it because she can't accept reality. She's not going to destroy it." I reached for his hand, feeling the tension vibrating through him. "We're going to fight this, and we're going to win. But we need to be strategic." For the next several weeks, we prepared our defense. Charles's legal team assembled a comprehensive record of our relationship, the contract, our subsequent decision to nullify it, the renewal ceremony, our shared life. I provided documentation of my work, my independent income, my active participation in our marriage as an equal partner. The hearing was scheduled for a cold Tuesday in December. Patricia arrived with her own legal counsel, a sharp-faced lawyer who radiated the kind of aggressive energy that made courtrooms uncomfortable for everyone. Joseph wasn't present. I learned later that he'd refused to participate, telling his mother that she was making a mistake and that he wouldn't help her destroy something that was already broken. The proceedings were tense, but ultimately, the judge ruled in our favor. The marriage was valid. The contract had been superseded by subsequent actions, and Patricia's claims were dismissed for lack of evidence. Walking out of the courthouse felt like emerging from a storm. The sky was clear, the air cold and sharp, and Charles's arm around my shoulders was the warmest thing I'd ever felt. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly. "I should have handled Patricia better. I should have seen this coming. How could you have predicted this?" I leaned into him, exhausted but relieved. She's his mother. She's always going to want the best for him, even when he doesn't want it for himself. The best for him isn't destroying our marriage. I stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Charles, I married you knowing there would be complications. I didn't marry you for an easy life. I married you because I love you. Every complication is worth it." His expression softened, the tension in his shoulders easing. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You saved me," I said simply. "You saw me when I was invisible and made me feel seen. The rest, that's just paperwork." He laughed, the sound rich and warm in the cold air. "I love you. Have I mentioned that recently?" "Once or twice." I tugged him closer. "But I don't mind hearing it again." He kissed me, there on the courthouse steps, with the city bustling around us and the weight of the legal battle finally lifted. It was a kiss that tasted like victory and relief and the quiet confidence of knowing we'd weather whatever came next. With the legal challenge behind us, we turned our attention to the future. The art therapy center had grown faster than I'd ever imagined, serving hundreds of clients and earning recognition from several national organizations. The demand for services far outpaced our capacity, and I knew it was time to expand. Charles, of course, was fully supportive. "What do you need?" he asked one evening, pulling out a notepad in a gesture that had become familiar. "More space, more staff, more funding." I listed the items on my fingers. "And time. I need more time to oversee it all." "Then we'll get you all of those things." He made notes, his pen moving quickly across the page. "I have connections with several foundations that fund mental health initiatives. I'll set up meetings. And as for time," he looked up, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "I could always take a more active role in the center's operations. You mentioned needing a development director. You want to work with me?" I blinked, surprised. "Charles, you're still CEO of Reed Holdings. You don't have time to." "I'll make time." He set down his notepad and took my hands. "I want to be part of what you're building, not just as a supporter, but as a collaborator. We're partners in everything else. Why not this?" The thought of working alongside him, sharing both the challenges and the triumphs, filled me with a warmth I hadn't expected. "You're serious?" "I've never been more serious about anything." He kissed my forehead. "Well, except for marrying you. That was the most serious decision I've ever made." "You're going to make me cry." "Good." He smiled. "I like it when you're emotional. It makes me feel like I'm doing something right." The expansion project took over our lives for the next several months. New locations, new staff, new programs. Every day brought fresh challenges and opportunities. Charles threw himself into the work with the same intensity he brought to everything, and I found myself falling in love with him all over again. But amid the chaos, we made time for each other. Morning coffee on the terrace, stolen lunches in his office, late-night conversations about everything and nothing. Our relationship had evolved from a contract to a partnership to something deeper, something I couldn't put into words but felt with every fiber of my being. On our first anniversary as a legally married couple, not the contract, but the real one, Charles surprised me with a trip to the coast. We spent a week in a small cottage overlooking the ocean, disconnected from the demands of work, reconnecting with each other. Thank you, I said one evening, sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. For this, for everything. You don't have to thank me. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders. I'm the one who should be thanking you. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning. You gave me hope that it wasn't too late for me to be loved. Charles, I know we don't talk about it often. He pressed a kiss to my temple. But I want you to know, you saved me. I was drifting, numb, going through the motions of a life that had no meaning. And then you came along, and suddenly everything had color again. You made me want to be better. You made me want to live. I turned to face him, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. You saved me too. You have no idea what it was like, being invisible, being dismissed, being treated like I didn't matter. And then you saw me. You actually saw me. And you made me feel like I was worth seeing. Because you are. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had escaped. You are worth everything. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. We stayed on the porch until the stars came out, wrapped in each other and the quiet certainty that we had found something rare and precious. The past was behind us, the hurt, the betrayal, the fear. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities we could only begin to imagine. And it was ours. All of it. 2 years later, the Art Therapy Center had become a beacon of hope in the city, serving thousands of clients and expanding to 5 locations. Charles had stepped down from his role at Reed Holdings, handing the reins to a capable successor so he could focus on our shared mission. Joseph and Elliot had found their own happiness, having moved to the coast to start a small vineyard. Patricia had finally come around, attending a family dinner where she apologized, genuinely, fully, for her actions. And I had found my purpose. On a warm summer evening, Charles and I sat on the terrace of our home, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The same terrace where everything had fallen apart had become the place where everything came together. Can you believe it? I asked, leaning my head on his shoulder. All of this, the center, the family, the life we've built. I never imagined it could be like this. Neither did I. His arm tightened around me. But I'm grateful for every moment. Even the hard ones. Even the engagement party. He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Especially the engagement party. If it hadn't happened, I might never have found the courage to cross that room and offer you a different path. So you're saying you planned it? Planned is a strong word. He kissed the top of my head. But I was always watching you. Always hoping. And when the opportunity came, I took it. I looked up at him. This man who had changed everything. I'm glad you did. Me too. He met my gaze, his eyes warm with love. Me too. We stayed there, wrapped in each other, as the stars emerged and the city hummed below. The past was just that, past. The future was ours, and it was brighter than I'd ever dreamed.